Oh, if we get we're ready to get started. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce our first speaker of 2025 in the BIMR Seminar series, Professor Sutton from the Department of Chemistry and Biochemistry at the University of South Carolina. Professor Sutton did his bachelor's degree at the University of Central Arkansas, which he completed in 2008. He then moved to Georgia Tech for his PhD under the supervision of Jean-Luc Degas, which he finished in 2014. And after that, he did a couple of postdocs. The first one at Duke University with Wade from 2014 to 2015. And then he received an Alexander von Humboldt postdoctoral fellowship to go to Berlin, to the Fritz Haber Institute, where he worked with Matthias Scheffer for about 5 years. After which he was recruited to his current position at the University of South Carolina as an assistant professor. There he has established a really exciting research program that involves machine learning methods to design, predict, and understand new materials. He has done some really tremendous work there, and for that, he has been recruited very recently to the University of Toronto and will be starting his sort of Canadian portion of his career very soon, by May. So today he's going to tell us about his work on machine learning and material discovery. Please join me in welcoming Professor Sutton.
Thanks a lot. It's certainly a pleasure to be here, and I hope we could collaborate. This will be nearby soon, and I hope some research here you might find that you'd be interested in collaborating on. So before I get started about the materials discovery part, we use computation to discover new materials, and the usual computational paradigm, if you need to use a computational tool, you have to make a choice between either high accuracy and high cost, so over here, versus low accuracy, so high error, but much more efficient. And in some cases, this sacrifice was absolutely necessary because you had to model things like these biomacromolecules, and it just wasn't possible to do it with a highly accurate system. So you had to use these classic potentials, which are parameterized, and they're much cheaper than quantum mechanics because you've coarse-grained out all the interactions with electrons. But you parameterize your model, and therefore it makes it less transferable to different systems. You have to sort of re-parameterize it every time you want to use it, beyond sort of what it was initially designed for. Machine learning, and specifically what I'll be talking about today is machine learning interatomic potentials, have bridged those two ends of this plot. We have high accuracy. Depending on the accuracy of the train set, you're training your model to that, so it's going to inherit that same accuracy of the method, the underlying method. And it's much more efficient than these quantum mechanics-based methods because you also are not actually solving the Schrodinger equation. So it's an exciting topic because it's able to produce both high accuracy, but also much more efficiently, so you could do things at a quantum mechanic level that you couldn't do before. In training machine learning models, you start from some train set, some set of input structures. Your model is going to basically lift some features from these molecules or materials. That's represented here in this block. Each entry in your train set or your data set in general is represented as a vector of some numerical properties. And then you train a model F that inputs these properties X and makes a prediction F of X in order to predict, for example, the energy of these structures. There are several considerations for exactly what the characteristics are of this function that you're training, specifically what these values are, the representation. For example, focusing on the representation itself, you have to take care that if you want to study atomistic systems, that the representation knows about symmetries of the atom. So as an example, if you want to use Cartesian coordinates to represent, say, this water molecule, that would be a very poor representation because if you translate the water molecule, the Cartesian coordinates are going to change. And therefore, that input to your model of f of x is going to have probably a different different prediction. And so this model is no longer invariant to these permutations, which is unphysical. That's the same case for permutations as well as rotations. So you want your representation to be aware of these underlying symmetries in the system. So we can't use Cartesian coordinates. That should be obvious now, and that was already well understood when you wanted to set up quantum mechanical calculations. Typically, you would use like the Z matrix, so you would rely on internal coordinates instead of these Cartesian coordinates. We also want, when you have a model, especially a machine learning potential, you want to make sure that the properties you're predicting, like the energy, are proportional with the system size. So you want to make sure this is size extensive. And what I'll show is like the energy, for example, if you have these two separated systems, that equals the energy twice of the energy when you bring them together. And you want to have a function that's smooth. So what is the main way of approaching this problem as a representation? For machine learning potentials, it goes back to, so let me, okay, so it goes back to work. I think one of the first demonstrations successfully of machine learning potentials was Jörg Böhler's work as in Michele Perinello's group, where they did two sort of instrumental things here. One is they had the total energy they want to represent as a sum over individual energies, so site-based energies, so E sub I. If you sum over all site energies, you get the total energy of the system. So that solves this size extensibility problem. The other thing is they want to represent you have to then represent the local environment. And to do that, you have some atom in some molecule, for example, and you have a series of radii that you then introduce a cutoff radius. And now you have to then build descriptors that are functions of those distances, or even three bodies, so say functions of angles in this case. And how you do that is you define a cutoff radius, and within that cutoff radius, you have bond distances, and you want a smooth function. Bond distances themselves would be smooth. And so then you place a series of Gaussians on the bond distance, and now you've passed the bond distance through a Gaussian, and that a sum of Gaussians creates a smooth function, and so this satisfies both problems. You could in their paper they called these symmetry functions. And so these series of Gaussians summed over the different atoms in the neighborhood give you satisfy all these requirements of the representation. And in this case, you also have the angles, and so you satisfy the rotational and angular aspects for the invariance. To build a model from this is just the representation, so the input into a model. You build these representations per atom, so G sub 0, or sub O here is for the representations for oxygen, and G sub H is for hydrogens. So you build this vector, these would just be numbers, based on these sums of Gaussians over the neighbors. And then you train a neural network that goes from this input representation to the local energy. So this is the energy of oxygen in this local environment. And if you perform the sum over all these local environments, you now get the total energy. And so this seems like quite obvious now, several years later, but at the time, this was a pretty clever idea in order to be able to train successfully these neural networks that are able to be applied to atomistic systems. And the field in general has sort of recycled this idea over and over and over, not just in terms of the sum of the local energies, but also of the representations. And so one example of that, these are neural network-based ones, but if you just replace a neural network with, for example, a kernel ridge-based algorithm, then you have what Gabor published in 2010 with Albert Bartok in the gap representation, or the SOAP representation, sorry. In this case, you still have these Gaussians placed on the bond distances within some cutoff radius, and then you first construct this. You define the radius. You place the Gaussians. You construct this local representation, and then you can pass that through some filter that gives you the spherically. In this case, a spherical harmonics filter that gives you the sort of rotationally invariant representation. So this now has knowledge of how, when you rotate your molecule, how it will behave in 3D space. And once you have this representation, you could pass it. You could train a model. In this case, is just sort of a kernel-based function where the actual algorithm itself, so the regression model, is a sum over training samples in this high-dimensional space. Here I'm showing the high-dimensional space just as one dimension x, but of course this would span the same dimensions as the length of your vector space. And in this case, the regression algorithm is essentially, we play the kernel trick here, where it's just looking at distances in this high-dimensional space. So if you have this continuous function here, which is a sum of Gaussians placed on the training samples, then a sample that's close to these in a training set will get the same prediction as the one in your training set. So if we just know the distance from a sample I in our training set versus a sample we want to make a prediction, then we can interpolate from our training set. If you train instead of kernel ridge regression, you could have different classes of, like the Gaussian process regression, which comes with also this uncertainty, which is what I'm showing here. So this both gives you a prediction, but also gives you an uncertainty analysis of how accurate your model is. So from my perspective, there are basically two categories of representations. You have the descriptor-based ones, which I've kind of illustrated both with the Böhler-Perinello symmetry functions, so placing Gaussians on bonds. These kernel-based methods like SOAP. And there's a whole set of these that I haven't talked about that are listed here. There's many different permutations of this idea. There's also another class of linear models based on essentially expanding more, providing more information based on the different bond distances. But these are all sort of well-defined equations that you're then building. You are counting something of the local structure and you're passing that through a regression algorithm. But you have sort of this well-defined way of lifting the features from the structure. There's kind of in my perspective, there's a sort of a different category, which are these graph-based neural networks, which I'll be discussing about today. In this case, you don't start from a well-defined sort of representation. You just map your atomistic structure to a graph, and then you learn the representation based on the graph. There's been much work on these representations. One key innovation was what's called message passing. So how does that work? Here we have instead of a three-dimensional structure and considering bond distances, we still have this cutoff, but now we represent it as a graph. So we have a series of sites that are treated as nodes, and the edges are just the distances. So any atom within the cutoff radius is related to the central node based on an edge. The edges themselves are represented here. So essentially we have this token so how do we define edges? It's the distance of position in space, r. It's some set of attributes that we can assign to it. For example, the atomic number, but that can be a much larger vector of properties related to Z or other properties, for example, like electronic structure properties of the atom. And even a set of learnable parameters, Hi. And those learnable parameters are passed through several layers, T. So T here indexes the layers in a neural network. We then construct a message between different sites. So this simulates sort of a two-body interaction where you have site I and site J, and then you have some edge function Eij that defines the interaction between the two, and then you have some message function that aggregates that information. And at each step, you update these set of parameters, Hi, with information that's aggregated from its neighbors. And that's this aggregation update. So that would be simply summing all of the different node attributes, the communication between the nodes, the messages together, and creating an average or taking their maximum. There's different ways you could aggregate that information, but usually some summary statistic from all the nodes within a certain cutoff. And then you perform this over and over and over for some number of steps or some number of layers, and that is how you update it. And eventually you get a set of node features. So sigma I now is at the last layer, which then you can collect in order to create the total, in this case, the total energy. You define some function that maps from the sites themselves to the total energy. And this is your neural network potential. So in this way, though we use a graph representation, you can see mathematically this simulates something like these two-body interactions building up to a many-body interaction. We start from interactions between sites, and then we allow communication between the two, which creates this many-body effect, and eventually we aggregate the final representation in order to make a prediction of the energy. So these representations simulate many-body interactions, and they also have this necessary requirement of being effectively local interaction that is summed up to a global property, which is important for the energy. So these neural networks, these message passing neural networks, have become state of the art. One key thing for potentials is how do we calculate forces, or how do we use forces in addition to energy? So far I've focused on energy, decomposing the total energy into essentially site energies. But how do we consider forces? Well, we've already worked out the relationship between forces and energies a long time ago. Feynman worked this out a long time ago. So we just take the derivative of the energy and get the forces. In this case, for a neural network, all we have to do is perform two steps of backpropagation, where we take the energy from one step, we take the derivative in the backpropagation step that gives us the forces, then we do a second backpropagation step to calculate the error, to update the neural network. So we need to essentially calculate energies, calculate forces through one iteration of backpropagation, then we calculate the update to the weights to the second step. So we just do double backpropagation, and for free we just know the energies. For free we get the forces just from doing this loop. And that's a lot more information. So not only do we now have energy per site, which has been decomposed from the total energy, so one property basically per material, but now we have forces, so 3 values per site. So it's a much richer feature set in order for us, or training set for us to train a neural network to. And this is also an explicitly local property, that there's 3 forces per site. So not artificially construct as local property based on the energy, but explicitly local. Now, this is, I would say, has become the usual way of doing it, but recently there are some other ideas about using not forces related directly to energies through the derivative, which is what we're doing through this double back propagation, but actually just treated totally separately. So you lose the explicit connection between the energies and forces. And instead, you just train to both sets. So there's a couple of neural networks that do that, but I would say the majority of them explicitly treat this interaction or this relationship. So they encode this physics into the learning step. So that's an introduction to machine learning potentials. I want to show you two different applications of machine learning potentials in my research. One, so here we start from DFT, and we want to basically train a model that then approximates DFT, so we can do something like what you could usually do with these analytical functions, like classic force fields, and apply them to two screening tasks for materials. So my research is primarily, a significant portion of my research has been devoted to understanding perovskite materials. The problem is, we want to model, we want to develop a machine learning model that inputs some information to the structure and predicts something like the stability, like a delta HF. Or if we want to apply this in some task like developing new photovoltaic materials, you want to predict the band gap energy. Now to do that, you could input either the structure, we want like the graph neural network lifts features from the structure, as I mentioned, but that requires having a well-defined structure in advance that you're then training your model to, which is not always the case, right? You don't know exactly what the material looks like. And in addition to that, that might be well-defined, it might be possible or, for cases where you have these well-defined lattices, but that breaks down quickly when you go to very large systems. And one case that we're particularly interested in are these hybrid organic-inorganic perovskites, where you have very, very complicated lattices of inorganic and organic bits together. Or it might be the case where you have these sort of complicated oxides, which we're also interested in. So perovskite materials in general, they have this formula ABX3. There are 3 different sites in the lattice. Typically, the B site is sort of defined by this network of corner sharing octahedra, where this B site cation is in the 6-coordinate environment, and A and B charge balance with X. These could be sort of oxides, for example, that are used in a lot of catalytic applications. There also could be halides. X could be halides, which is useful for photovoltaics. But these materials, because of the sort of flexible functional form, are found in a lot of different applications. In terms of screening them, if you just look at the structure and you fix the structure, but you want to combine different elements, and you do it, you select from the periodic table, sort of ignore a lot of F-block elements, and you just limit the combination of elements based on charge balancing. So if we just have them have a neutral formula overall, then you can find that there are basically almost 200,000 compositions. If you allow, in this case, I've allowed actually sort of a double the formula, so it's AA prime, BB prime. So a lot of chemical flexibility. And if you look at what's been tabulated in the field for perovskites that have been used as photovoltaics, which is one of the main recent applications, recent because it's only been about 10 years that they've been applied as PV materials, then there's been about 1,000 compounds that have been investigated. But even in that chemical space, it's basically the formula is largely like this. We have a couple of choices for the A site cation. This can be organic or inorganic, typically organic. And the B site cation is limited to lead. Plus, there's a halide that's iodide plus some other mixture. So there's a really constrained formula, and the majority of this investigation in the field has been basically trying to find different combinations of cations, organic or inorganic, and doping or mixing some additional halide with iodide. So even though it's 1,000 compounds, it's largely limited in a very narrow chemical space. If you look at the materials project, which catalogs a lot of computational data, then you can see that there's about 2,500 compounds that have been available or published there. So we know about the inorganic space. This is experimental compounds. That's because this ambitious work done by the Helmholtz-Zentrum by Jesper Jacobsen led a team to go through the field and actually by hand catalog what has been published in the literature. So this is a really wonderful database if you're interested in perovskites. From a computational perspective, if you want to screen this large space, so actually calculate the properties of all these 200,000 materials that are there, where do you start? You start from some structure that's been downloaded, that's been recorded by the experimentalists. We download it, download the CIF file, And then you could take all the elements and substitute them on the lattice. And that combination of different elements will change the stability. It will also change the band gap. And so in this case, this strategy of sort of using some template and then combining many, many different elements has been adopted before. And that allows you to screen these very, very large spaces. But it also, by definition, limits you to just one lattice, because you've sort of emphasized breadth and composition over actual structural diversity. And that may not always be sort of a realistic approximation, because in materials, of course, as you start to combine different elements on the structure can relax from something like this ideal cubic to something like this orthorhombic. And in fact, for the perovskite specifically, this has been worked out already by Bob Glaser several years ago. There's about 23 different phases related by these octahedra tilting. So here you can see the octahedra all align, but they can adopt different tilting angles. And that structure then becomes a little bit lower symmetry. And there are 23 different phases that sort of can be related to this octahedral tilting. So this is a huge phase space, but most effort has been focused just on the cubic phase itself. So in addition to so for these perovskites, in addition to the possibility of different phases, it's also necessary to understand the evolution of the phase as a function of temperature. So DFT calculations are performed at 0 Kelvin, so way over here. But in reality, experimentally, what's been observed is that these materials can adopt different phases over different temperatures. So in this case, this y-axis is the lattice parameters. The lattice parameters here on this far left side, so that about 300 Kelvin, there's two that are almost similar and one that's very, very much smaller. So it's something like this orthorhombic phase. And as you heat the system, it eventually, all the lattice parameters look very similar, so it adopts this cubic phase. And you'll find this in the literature for these compounds, that there's this evolution of the phase as a function of temperature. And so ideally, if we're going to screen the compounds, we'd not only be able to take in realistic structures, but would also be able to account for the chemical diversity, or the phase diversity over different temperatures. So we started this work a few years ago. We had a paper out that Will Baldwin, who was a student in a collaborator of mine, Gabor Ciani's group at Cambridge. So this is his work from 2 summers ago now. But we started by trying to map the phase diagrams and using a machine learning potential, a graph neural network specifically, to do this. So what I'm showing you here, the top panel, is the previous work on this field. So this is a parameterized sort of classic force field. And you can see that there's not much change in the lattice parameters themselves over the temperature, as opposed to compared to the experimental one here. In our calculations, these solid lines are all calculations compared to the experimental result that I just showed on the previous slide. So we took that from the publication, and you can see that our model gets qualitatively the correct phase diagram. It's shifted down. So here, the bottom lattice vector is about 6 angstroms as opposed to 6.15 angstroms. That's because we train this model to DFT, in particular the LDA functional in this case, and that underestimates the unit cell size by about 10%, or in this case 0.1 angstroms. So we're training our model to DFT, and that DFT automatically underestimates experiment. But in general, you can see that our model actually reproduces quite realistically, besides the shift on the y-axis, the overall phase diagram. So this is a really nice result, we thought, for the machine learning potentials. In addition to that, it's able to map variations of the structure. And what's surprising to us around that time was that the structure is actually so dynamic. And so typically, in this case, what I'm showing is a sort of a snapshot of an MD simulation. And what we're cataloging on the octahedral tilting as a way of showing how much structural changes are occurring. And there are 3 slices here, depending on the direction of the octahedral tilting, so X versus Y versus Z. And this is the degree that it's tilting. So what you see are these pockets of blue and red, meaning octahedral tilting dynamically in one direction versus the other. And occasionally in the simulation, what you'll see are these sort of staggered faults, where one length or one axis of the unit cell in this case the simulation box shows that it's tilting in one direction, and to accommodate that, the next layer will tilt in the other direction. So the structure is not something like we typically view like simple cubic, but it's actually quite dynamic. So this is the simulation for 550 Kelvin. And after this work, there was some work also by Mike Toney around the same summer that we published ours, which actually looked at this experimentally and reported something similar phenomenon of this dynamic local ordering that they called in these ABX3 systems. In this case, they used organic cations instead of inorganic systems. There's also, around the same time, a paper came out that reported that this, what's called this Rochabal-Josephhaus spin splitting event occurs in perovskites, and they related it to this local symmetry breaking. And so the structure could be, this dynamic structure they're observing could be related to the change in electronic properties, which could lead to, for example, spin splitting. So it's something that we're still investigating exactly the relationship between these two aspects. But for this talk, I want to focus on the generalizable part of machine learning potentials. So in this work, we trained one machine learning potential that's very accurate to one system. And can be a tedious task. So this is a video Will put together where he was constructing this potential. And the way it works is you start first from something that's not very good. You start to run an MD simulation, you've trained it to energies and forces, you run an MD simulation, and it breaks immediately. The atoms fly off because you enter a configuration that the model hasn't seen yet. And machine learning is just interpolating. So it hasn't seen it, it doesn't really know how to handle it. And in some cases, you'll see that the atoms get too close or they just totally break. And then eventually, you reach a point using active learning schemes where you run enough MD simulations and you find the cases where it's blown up and you add that back to the training set and you retrain the model. Eventually, you get to a case where now you have a stable potential. And you can do great things with that, like I showed the phase diagram, but it takes many, many loops to get to this point sometimes. Now, when machine learning potentials first sort of were being developed, so that's 2007 from Jörg Biller's work, and then later Justin Smith, so 10 years later, developed what's called NE1. The goal was already to make these potentials as broadly applicable as possible. Excuse me. And so in this case, in Justin's work, he trained this to a very diverse set of organic molecules that he calculated all by hand. And this work I quite admire because it was done at a time before when it was a little bit more difficult. So for example, they state in their paper that all the trainings and predictions were done with in-house code of C++ and CUDA in order to accelerate this package. So they didn't have at that time TensorFlow or PyTorch. So he had to write all of this by hand. Right? So he had to write this by hand, this double back propagation. Now, when we want to perform this task, we just sort of import PyTorch and do it. And thankfully, some of the developers from Google and Facebook have helped us along to be able to do this, right? These are all public softwares. But Justin did this work before that was possible. So I think this is really admirable work overall, but it also is kind of a beautiful demonstration of how transferable the neural networks can be. So in the case I showed you, there's one composition, cesium lead iodide, between one accurate potential. Here, there's accurate potential to very large chemical space of organics. And there's some tricks that, if you talk to Justin about this, that he mentioned he did. We sort of did this, what's called curriculum learning. So you start from some small molecules and you iterate the training to get higher and higher. But nonetheless, it worked quite well. Now, that's the case for organics. And then recently, so Gabor's group published, along with all his sort of collaborators, were involved in this large training of a model that has been titled now sort of foundation models. And foundation models mean there's the foundation for you to start some subsequent task. So this is called MACE MP0 because it was the MACE potential. So it's a graph neural network framework developed by Gabor's group. And it's been applied to the materials project dataset that was made available. And this work wouldn't be possible unless places like the materials project started to open up their data sets for training. And it's called MP0. The 0 part implies that there's going to be subsequent versions of this, of course. So this is a foundation model. So in principle, there should be a model that's been trained to a very, very large chemical space, and therefore can generalize also to a large chemical space. And what's interesting about this demonstration, so this came online at December 23, so at the end of 2023. And what was interesting about this is something I wouldn't have believed before seeing it in this work. So what happened in the progress of the work was Gabor's group trained this very large model to the materials project and had all his collaborators apply it to these different tasks. And one task, and the materials project, for those of you who don't know, is just inorganic materials, calculated inorganic materials. And they applied it, for example, to model CO oxidation on copper. because one of Gabor's collaborators is Carsten Reuter at the Fritz Haber Institute. And so here what you're seeing is the reaction coordinate and the relative energy of the barrier, and comparison of MACE with dispersion correction, PBE with a dispersion correction. That's exactly the same functional that MACE was trained to, plus this Beef van der Waals functional that's been used in the catalytic in the field for heterogeneous catalysis. And what you can see is in some cases, like the CO surface 110, that it maps the barriers pretty well, even though it has never seen up to this point some demonstrate or any sample that's been that would look like this. It's only seen solid state inorganic materials. What's also kind of surprising to me is that it can actually be applied to organic molecules, or was applied in this case to organic molecules. So here, this is chingolan, which is just a 10 residue sort of fictitious protein, and it's being used to map the folding of the protein. So this is the radius gyration, and this is the unfolded protein that eventually, over some given time, eventually folds. You can see that by this plot. So even though there are some carbon and hydrogens in the materials project because they're in some solid state systems, but they're not proteins in the materials project, and yet it is able to be applied to that and successfully sort of model this folding. So this is quite interesting result that once it seems that once the model has been trained to a very large system, it can start to generalize rules it's learned from that even to cases that hasn't been explicitly exposed to. And that's the beauty of having a foundation model, is that it's learned some deeper rules from a large data set. Now, this has been around now for a year, and so there's been a lot of work showing where it's useful and where it fails, which is always the usual route, right? There's been a lot of work on how DFT can be accurate, or also how it can be, where it can fail. One case where it really does poorly is mapping out sort of dimers, because there are no dimers in materials projects. So like chromium dimer, it's not going to do very well for. So this is not to say that MACE MP0 model sort of can replace DFT out of the box, but it's to say that in terms of trying to obtain a generalizable transferable model, this is an interesting demonstration. So how do we want to use it in a downstream task? So we start from something like the MACE MP0, so some large transferable model, and we want to fine tune it to our specific task. So in this work, what we did is we started from a data set that contains only 340 of the ABX3 compounds. That's out of a data set about 200,000. We took these unit cells, we randomly perturbed them. So we displaced atoms, added some random noise to their positions, calculated the energies and forces in a large supercell of 80 atoms, and then added that back to the train set, and we fine-tuned to this data set. So a very narrow slice of the compositional space, extended slightly based on the atoms and forces that have been perturbed in the structure, and then that leads to about a data set of about 3,000 samples. So we took the MACE MP0 model, and we fine-tuned it to this data set. And this is a very, very relatively small data set from a computational perspective, and then we applied it to a much larger space. And how does it work? So here, this is the MACE fine-tuned model relative to DFT. And this is structures relaxed. So this DFT at MLIP implies that we've optimized the structure with MLIP, and now we're comparing the DFT energy at that structure versus the MACE model at that same structure. And this is 40 millieV per atom, which is a reasonable accuracy from our perspective for the formation energy. It's also the case that if we did two different tasks, one is to these sort of cubic structures, and we also applied it to a smaller set of these sort of tilted orthorhombic structures I mentioned that are important in these material class. You can see in this case it performs a little bit better, but that's probably just based on it being a smaller compositional space. But nonetheless, these for us were looking very, very good. And then we could start to do, once we have a cheap potential, we could start to ask very complicated questions from the data set, which would have been impossible a few years ago with just DFT. So for example, we can take the potential and apply it to the whole space. In this case, we've taken a subset of just a cesium A, B, B prime X1s, and investigate, for example, what does it look like in terms of stability if you take one of the A site atoms and you change it. So you go from cesium-2 to something that's smaller. So this is sort of decreasing size of the A site. And Victor Goldschmidt, 100 years ago, published this Goldschmidt tolerance factor, which has really guided a lot of the work in trying to find stable compositions in the field. And what this tells us is that effectively the ratio of the A site radius and the B site radius scaled a little bit, but effectively that radius really determines whether or not something will form the structure. And conceptually that makes sense because the A site sits and kind of holds these octahedra together. And so the A site's too small, the octahedra will collapse on themselves. It'll go from corner sharing to face sharing. so what you can see here is this is a difference between the energy of this cubic phase versus the energy of this orthorhombic phase. And the energy gets much larger as you decrease the size of the second A site cation. And that's pulling up the energy, which means that this structure becomes much more stable than this structure. So this sort of this confirms or is consistent with this Goldschmidt tolerance factor. And what was surprising to us is actually, in terms of the number of compositions with this space about 24,000 compounds, there's a really small subset that at 0 Kelvin are actually stable in the cubic phase, which, as I mentioned in the introduction, was one of the main phrases that's been approximated, that's been used as a template for screening these large spaces. So what this means, of course, is if you change the structure, you're going to change the stability. You're also going to change the band gap energy in particular. So if you're screening materials for example, photovoltaics, then you're going to be particularly concerned with whether or not the cubic is the ground state. We could also, having a large data set, we can analyze, well, what is the right element combinations that form stable materials? So which elements prefer which sites, basically. So in this case, this is the difference of the energy aggregated over the entire data set between if an element is on the A site versus the B site. So we just calculate for all the structures that are available with those two elements, what is the difference in their energy on average. And we can see some elements strongly prefer, so this is a negative value, so this value is much more stable, strongly prefer being on the A site. And eventually there's some transition. Some elements have very little preference. And then there's a transition where the majority of elements strongly prefer being on the B site. So there's only a subset of elements that are actually can form stable, energetically form stable perovskites on the A site, if used on the A site. So this dramatically narrows down this large chemical space of how we can select elements for different sites in order to find new stable materials. It's not sufficient, as I showed earlier in my talk, there's a phase diagram that we need to also consider. So it's not sufficient to just calculate the stability of these materials at 0 Kelvin, but we have to understand how the energy might change as a function of temperature. So DFT then gives us this 0 Kelvin term, but we have to calculate the entropic contribution to calculate the free energy. For solid state materials, one of the main terms in this entropic term is the vibrational entropy. To calculate the vibration, so we have diagrams like this is the phonon dispersion curves. So these are all the phonon bands. We have to calculate all the vibrations, the phonons, in order to calculate the free energy term. And that's a very difficult calculation with DFT because it requires calculating vibrations at many different K points. But with the maze potential, we get forces, we train it to forces, so it should be accurate in calculating the vibrations. And that's what you see here, where you get similar phonon bands. So the overlap between the red line and the black line implies that the model's pretty accurate in calculating phonons, which means that we can actually accurately calculate the free energy then. And what was interesting on the one on the left, you could see that there are actually imaginary frequencies in the structure, implying that it's going to relax to something lower in energy. So it's not stable in the cubic. These are both performed in the cubic phase. So we can start to approach this problem with mapping out the phase diagrams. In this case, we take this one potential that's been fine-tuned, and we calculate the free energy difference between the two phases as a function of temperature. So it's a very expensive calculation that becomes easy to do because of the cheap potential. And we can calculate the temperature at which the cubic phase becomes lower in energy, these different compositions. And so now we have a database of stable materials that are also entropically stable, potentially at higher temperatures. And that gives us a set of structures that we can then train another model to input to in order to predict the band gap energy. In this case, we use a much more rigorous functional than PBE. So PBE is okay for solid state materials, typically for the ground state and for the stability, but it's not sufficient for band gap. And the PBE functional has about 2 EV error for band gaps. So if you want to produce a database that might be useful for experimentalists to go pursue potential photovoltaic materials, then you want to make sure you have the right estimates for stability and also the right estimates for band gaps. So in this case, we use the HSC06 functional, which has a more accurate band gap, and we train a model that takes these MLIP structures and produces the band gap, and we subsequently validated the model to have an error about 0.2 EV relative to HSC06. So we can produce a plot like this, which gives us stable materials from this large space, but also the band gaps within a certain range. Okay, so that was how we can use machine learning potentials and very large generalizable potentials for large compositional spaces and relatively narrow structural space. But how do we tackle problems like this, where we don't really know what the structure looks like because it's so complicated in advance? So here we relied on templating still, but just slightly investigated possible structures that might relax to. But that's typically not possible in this case. It's hard to define a template structure to enumerate new organics or new organic elements on the sites. And the reason why it's hard is because the phase space here is way more complicated than all inorganic systems. So here I'm showing different examples of the structures that were reported experimentally. And the nomenclature around this is to label them based on the dimensionality. But the dimensionality here is just the dimensionality of the inorganic lattice. So 0D means you have isolated octahedra in a sea of organics. 1D means you have these octahedral chains that extend only in one dimension, versus 2Ds where you have these 2D layers of the inorganic octahedra separated by organic molecules. And so this is the work with Gabor and Will, where we had this idea of starting from a set of organics, selecting what the inorganic lattice might be, and then using machine learning to do the heavy lifting and predicting the final structure. So ground state structure prediction is a very difficult task. It's been sort of a big bottleneck in the field. And we wanted to use machine learning to sort of make this a bit easier for us. And this project, this was a very ambitious idea when we first started it. So this proposal was funded through this work was funded through the Air Force. This proposal was probably drafted in about 2019. And at the time, this seemed like totally impossible. But then during the course of this project, a lot of development in the machine learning part of the machine learning force fields made this possible. So what does it look like in terms of a data set? We have a set of organics that we want this model to be useful for. So we looked in the literature, grabbed all the organic molecules in the literature, and we use that in our training set. And you can see chemically they're quite diverse. And then we have to train the model using this loop that I defined earlier. So we start from the ones that we grabbed from the literature for the experimentally reported ones. We split them basically evenly into a training and test set. With the training compositions, we perform that active learning loop. And eventually we get to a large training set after exposing the model over and over and over to cases where it had failed. So the initial set, we start from the optimized experimental structures and we displace the atoms like I mentioned before. We add Gaussian noise based on the distances, or sorry, based on the sites to each site in the unit cell. We calculate the energies and forces of these structures. In terms of the active learning loop, the way we anticipate where the model might fail is through uncertainties. And in this case, we train a committee of models. So we have 3 different machine learning potentials that have been trained independently. And we apply them. This is an MD simulation. So this is the 3 models being applied in the MD simulation. So to the same configurations over and over and over. And as you evolve through time, eventually the models, this is the forces. And again, the forces are predicted for all elements in the unit cell. There are 3 forces. And we take the difference between the forces on each atom. And we look at where the models disagree. And here you have the forces, the disagreement is very, very large. And that's our estimate for uncertainty. So if the neural networks that have been trained make very different predictions for the same forces, then we call that a highly uncertain sample. So this is what's called the query by committee framework, where we use uncertainties based on disagreements between a committee of models. And if it exceeds a certain threshold that we have to set by hand, we grab these samples, we put them back into the model, and we train it. So that's our active learning loop. And at the end of this, we have this data set of 2,500 samples. We could calculate its energy, both in terms of the training test set. You can see here that these values are in the millieV per angstrom. So they're very, very accurate for forces. And that's really the key thing. For stable MD trajectories, you want very, very accurate forces for your ML potential. And then we could apply it to all the test set compositions and run MD simulations, which look like this. And we can validate it on a very large MD set of samples. And here I'm showing how it has been applied to very different different chemistries and is still able to run stable MD simulations. We can also validate how it looks for the structures itself relative to DFT. Since it's been trained in DFT, it should look very accurate. Here, these are RDFs, so the radial distribution function. This is basically a continuous sort of catalog of the bond distances. This is the bond distance in the structure. And the fact that the blue line and the orange line overlap implies that they're very accurate, that the model that's been optimized reproduces the DFT optimized structure, which is an independent calculation. So now that we have an accurate potential, we're confident we can sort of tackle the second problem, which is take any arbitrary organic molecule, any arbitrary inorganic lattice, and predict the 3-dimensional structure from that. To do that, we need to have a way of suggesting possible organic, we need some way of generating structures. And what we've focused on was treating the organic lattice part as a sort of a ligand binding problem. So in ligand binding, you have some well-defined pocket or lattice, slab, and you want to put the organic molecule in different permutations. So for example, you can have different orientations of the organic molecule, or you can have different angles relative to the surface. And so these are all hand-coded. So we create a set of different possible stochastic operations. We have a list of ranges that we allowed. So the tilt angle could only go plus or minus 15 degrees, for example. And then we apply it to this large set for any given organic molecule. And then that gives us pretty bad structures. But because we have energies and forces trained in our model, we can then optimize them subsequently. And that's what you see. You start from a bad guess. The stochastic sampling algorithm isn't that good. And it's sort of a brute force approach. But we rely on the fact that the MLIP is very cheap. And so we could give it a bad guess and still optimize to something that looks reasonable. And then we could do this over and over and over for many different permutations of the organic slab. And we could just rank these all by energy. And the lowest one becomes the one that we think is the ground state. So in this case, we encoded several different heuristics that we sort of observed from the database, basically where the organic is placed, because they have these amine groups. That makes our problem a little bit simpler. But ultimately, then we get pictures like this, where we have these different permutations and there's their placement on the surface itself. So because we have many different guesses, then we have all of these energies that we have to evaluate. Here, what I'm showing is the relative energy to the experiment. So we knew in this case what the experimental result was as a sanity check, and that's this line. So this is DFT on the experiment, then the MLIP on the experiment. So there's some error between the two because the MLIP model has been trained in DFT, but it has some error. And these are all the trial structures. And eventually what we see is we start from some pretty bad guesses. These are the initial guesses. They're not so good, but that's okay because we have this sort of brute force approach. Eventually we get to something that looks very, very similar to the experimental compound. And we could reapply this. So these violin plots are summarizing this entire distribution. So this violin plot extends here to the maximum value. The bubble here is around the mean here. That would be something like these samples that are selected, are sampled through from the index of 20 to 80. And eventually you get to the ground state. And this bottom one, the ground state, is in all these cases, there's an experimental counterpart. So we're comparing our independently predicted structure to what's been available experimentally. And you can see in most cases, we reproduce the experimental structure. There's some disagreement in one case. In another case, we actually have something that's slightly lower in energy. But otherwise, we get exactly the same energy as what the experimental structure looks like. So this is confirmation that for a diverse set of organic cations, we can actually accurately reproduce the structure using this one model. But the proof is whether or not we could apply this to a totally new compound outside of the data set that we've sort of scrubbed from the internet. And in this case, we start from a molecule that was of interest to our collaborators at the Air Force Research Lab in Dayton, Ohio. And we predicted the structure to have we predicted this compound to have this structure. This is a totally new prediction that hasn't been reported yet. And then we asked our collaborators to sort of synthesize it. What was interesting is, just as we observed here, that there are several different structures that are slight differences, slight permutations between relative to each other that have very similar energies. So here I'm showing the minimum plus 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. And you can see structurally, they look very different, actually. Mostly that's due to the swapping of the organic cation. So it's intriguing. It's interesting to us that their energies are very, very small, but structurally they look very, very different. Experimentally, this is the difference. So the ones that we have, let's say, within the 5th ground state, I'm showing the XRD that we could generate computationally based on the structure that we predicted. And this is compared to the experiments. And what's interesting to us is that the XRD spectrum sort of overlap, even though the organic bit is a little bit different in each case. So that's because the XRD is largely based off the inorganic lattice, that gives the largest signal. And there's very slight differences, very subtle differences between these spectrum. So it's good that we can reproduce, that the experimentalists can reproduce our prediction. That's great. That's a validation of our method. But also, it led to an interesting observation that there are many different phases that could be viable in these materials that are not really readily detected by XRD. So this summer, my student is going to the Air Force to sort of work this idea out in collaboration with Josh Kennedy at the Air Force. Okay, so that was sort of the main two applications, but before I end, I just want to mention that some of our work has also led to this large collaboration with Ravi Shankar Raman at RPI, Charles Musgrave at Colorado, Derek Vigil-Fowler at Berkeley, at NREL, and Maro Javben at Berkeley. So all of us together in this big group have developed a database of catalysts. So if you're interested in different catalytic reactions, we sort of have produced a new database called BeastDB. It's BeastDB because the name Beast comes from beyond DFT for electrochemistry. And it's beyond DFT, so we use grand canonical DFT for these calculations. We also vary the bias voltage in order to try to simulate realistic cases that you encounter in electrochemistry. And you can access this database here. This link, there's also an API, or sorry, a portal that you could access, and you can download the structures themselves, you can visualize them, you could calculate as a function of the applied potential, what is the absorption energy, for example, because we've done the grand canonical DFT calculations here. Okay, so with that, I'd just like to summarize. So we use machine learning potentials to predict new ground state structures, the complicated organic, inorganic materials, which was subsequently validated from our experimental colleagues. That gives us hope that we have an accurate method, but it also has led to more questions about exactly what the diversity of these phases, which is not inconsistent with what we see sort of in the local disorder. So we think this question about the disorder of the materials that's available versus what's actually are present versus what's actually observed experimentally is a quite complicated question that we're still trying to unravel and tackle. We can also then calculate new materials then and produce data sets that actually have stable materials as a function of temperature. So we can get realistic temperatures in our calculations to tell us what the right phase is at the relevant temperatures. Before I end, I introduced machine learning potentials, but I also want to show that this is, I hope I showed that this is a large field, there's a lot of development happening. And I want to kind of end on an outlook of where I think things are now and sort of what the near-term future looks like. So I mentioned this active learning scheme using this query by committee. I think that's an essential tool for trying to refine your model. It's been used, it will continue to be used in any sort of machine learning application. So for example, at the Acceleration Consortium, they're going to use an uncertainty algorithm in order to sample new experiments. So this is a baseline method used in all applications of machine learning. But how it's used in training machine learning potentials is maybe not optimal because we just look at the differences in forces, and that's probably just a little bit imperfect in how it's done. But so I think we need better uncertainty quantifications methods. And I want to, if you're interested in this topic in general, I think Thomas Swinburne's recent work here on the archive, it's not yet published, is a really promising direction how to tackle this kind of problem if you're interested on that. What I didn't talk about is the fact that our methods lack long-range interactions. So that's okay for solid state. We have atoms that are very close together. But for interfaces, we have liquid and solids with like something like a zinc ion coming down to a surface embedded in an aqueous solution. It's going to be very difficult to model that. And this incorporation of long-range electrostatics is still sort of an open question of how to do it. And there's still room for development in this topic. And the main approach currently basically is to sort of use this local cutoff that gives you the short-range term and then add a correction for the long-range interactions. And this is not a dispersion correction. This is a correction for the Coulombic interactions. And that is basically where the field has kind of landed on at this point. But there's some interesting work, in particular by Anders Nicholson at Los Alamos, who's worked on incorporating polarizability, so allowing these atoms to polarize and charge calibration schemes. I think this is a really promising direction, but there's a lot more work that can be done on this topic. There's also kind of an interesting question in the field about how important equivariance is. I mentioned this rotational equivariance. Typically, that's encoded through the spherical harmonics filter that we can apply. And it comes with a much more extra cost. And it seems that your model, if you train it to a very large data set, your model might learn that. And that's been already realized in like computer vision, but it's important to see how well that works actually for atomistic systems. So the more that we publish these really large models, it might be that the equivariance is actually learned automatically because they're so large. And one example of that is the recent publication of AlphaFold v3, which actually doesn't use equivariance explicitly in the model itself. It learns it instead from the data set. And this is being used to predict three-dimensional structures of proteins where it needs to know sort of the the relative orientation of atoms in space. So it has to have this sort of radial component, and yet it learns that it seems from the data set. Okay, so with that, I'd also like to thank my group members. So this is my group currently. Zach has did a lot of the work for the Prof stuff. He's now in industry, so I have to add him here post hoc to the picture. And Nima, who's also not in the picture actually. Nima did a lot of work on the hybrid organic inorganic perovskites in collaboration with Gabor and his student Will, as well as our collaborator Josh Kennedy. And this work was funded both by the DOE as well as the Air Force. And of course, I'll be joining the AC in May, to University of Toronto in May 2025. And if you're interested in collaborating or discussing more of the topics I mentioned here, please feel free to reach out and email me. With that, I'd also like to thank you for your attention and be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Any questions? So, by the way, at the end of your summary, mentioned as a variance, I was wondering if there was any network or solutional network where the variance and
I'm sorry, say it one more time.
So at the very end of your summary, you mentioned the problem with microvariance.
Yeah.
I was wondering if in the field there's been any attention made on convolutional neural networks or convolutional neural networks where it's kind of built to the neural network with the invariances and the variance.
So there's three types, right? So the CNNs as a baseline don't include the this sort of angular component, right? So that, I mean, Max Bellini has already published a lot on that for image recognition tasks where you use CNNs typically. Now, CNNs are not used in materials because they don't actually have a lot of the correct permutational invariance in the method. So typically, I would say there has been some demonstrations of CNNs, but the field has moved past those, and the graph is really the way to go at this point if you want to use a neural network. Mostly because it has a message passing scheme, but also gives you the ability to use a neural network in this case, which tends to be a lot more accurate. So I'm not so aware of what's been done in convolutional neural networks in particular. Was your question specific to convolutional neural networks? But in general, right now, the sort of spherical harmonics term is how we get the radial, sort of angular component for the equivariance. It's radial equivariance. And that's been the primary innovation dating all the way back from like 2010 with SOAP, which is how it was used to generate the spice spectrum. But yeah, I'm not sure what's going to happen. Maybe we ditch the equivariance, we just learn it through data augmentation. I don't know, because it's much faster if you don't have it. Uh-huh.
Run into issues in certain situations, but you mentioned that this was not framed as a replacement for DFT, and I'm wondering why that is the case, because it's quite clear that it's quite competent in a lot of areas.
No, I think it's just the fundamental limitation of machine learning is why it's not going to be a replacement for DFT, because there will be undoubtedly cases where the model is not going to be useful, and it's going to dramatically fail, in fact. And that's a deeper topic of generalizability of these methods, which is there's no real good mathematical framework for that discussion. But basically, it's kind of I mean, it's good that you applied it to organics or inorganics. Yeah, so that's where it was trained to. So it's going to do pretty well for those, right? And for example, in my own work, we use it for lithium dynamics. It doesn't know anything about lithium dynamics, but it does pretty well because it knows about forces in inorganic systems. And the more you use it for cases that it doesn't know about, like charged dimers, it's going to totally fail because that's not in the training set. And so the further away from the training set you get in this sort of fictitious, high-dimensional space, it becomes less accurate. And the likelihood for failure becomes much higher. But you could imagine that there is going to be at some point, and this is a big topic right now in my field, and there's a lot of places that are basically taking all the data that they can find online and concatenating it all and training a model to that. And that might lead to somewhere promising where it could replace DFT, let's say. But what my comment was meant to imply is that any machine learning potential is going to be limited to its training set. right? The distribution of its train set. And DFT is not limited to that, right? It's just based on physics. And so it could be applied to anything arbitrarily, whereas machine learning potentials have to be carefully applied to things, to new systems that might be far away from its train set. Yeah.
Where do you see, for example, course being used for that specifically, or used to rely, for example, the physics space to explain the instability of these materials?
Yeah. So one failure mode, one instability mechanism for these halide perovskites is these iodide being created in the lattice and the defect being moved to the material. In that case, you could study the defect dynamics, the likelihood of the creation of a defect. That's an energy calculation that the model can be used for. How it propagates the material with time, it can be used to model that. But so you could use it to model these sort of ground state dynamics, so the ground state structure and the dynamics of the ground state. But in other ways, for the other failure modes, for example, I don't know how useful it would be. Like humidity effects of perovskites, it's not going to be very useful for that. So there are a lot of ways that the halide, the lead iodide bond breaks, right? There's a lot of reasons why it could break. Some of those cases it can be modeled, but some cases not.